Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Service Animals, Your Independence, Your Access, and Your Rights. My name is Robin Coker. I'm the Director of Communications at Disability Rights Florida. I'm a white woman with blonde hair, wearing glasses, and a pink shirt with a beige sweater. On the screen, we have a PowerPoint slide that has a purple background with white letters and the DRF logo. The speakers for today's webinar are Marion Gwizdala, President and CEO of Advocates for Service Animal Partners, and Barb Page, Senior Advocate-Investigator with Disability Rights Florida. First, we'll review the accessibility features for this webinar. Our webinar includes closed captions and American Sign Language. Closed captions are available at the bottom of your screen by using the button that says CC. We have 2 American Sign Language interpreters today. They are spotlighted on your screen and should be visible at all times. If you cannot find them, you can make sure that your participants setting shows all video participants. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them in the Q&A. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. You can also send your questions to the email address webinar@disabilityrightsflorida.org, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And as a caution and to protect your privacy, please don't put personal information in the Q&A. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website and YouTube channel. Now that the housekeeping is complete, I'll pass things along to Barb.
Great. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am a white woman with blue glasses and wearing a purple shirt in front of the Disability Rights Florida logo background. I'm going to share a little bit of information about our protection and advocacy program, and then I will hand it over to Marion. The Disability Rights Florida is a protection and advocacy program, which is to protect the rights of people with disabilities. We are federally funded through 9 separate grants, and we serve all Floridians with all types of disabilities. We are not disability specific. And our mission statement is Disability Rights Florida advocates, educates, investigates, and litigates to protect and advance the rights, dignity, equal opportunities, self-determination, and choices for all people with disabilities. I'm going to turn it over to Marion so he can introduce himself.
Good morning. Thank you, Barb. My name is Marion Gwizdala. As Barb said, I'm the CEO and president of Advocates for Service Animal Partners. I am a white male with graying strawberry blonde hair and equally graying beard and a mustache, wearing a pink shirt. And over my shoulder is the logo for Advocates for Service Animal Partners.
Very good. And on the screen, it says that Advocates for Service Animal Partners are dedicated exclusively to supporting, enhancing, and protecting rights of individuals with service animals, nationwide network of volunteer service animal advocates, encourage, educate, and support service animal handlers, and provide education regarding service animals to employers, governmental entities, private companies, housing accommodations, and airline industry. You sure do a lot, Marion. So that's right. So today's learning objectives, we're going to learn a little bit about the definition of a service animal, how to determine whether it is a service animal or not, the explanation of the various laws which protect the mutual rights and responsibilities, which means both for the handlers who own the service animal, and also we're going to touch upon business owners and what their rights and responsibilities are. And then we're also going to tell you where you can go for help if you face discrimination. And I want to just make a special note that, you know, we cannot advise you on any specific cases today, so please don't put personal information into the chat. Contact our intake department if you want to request individual assistance, and our contact information will be provided at the end. We're going to start off with a poll question. So the poll question number 1 for you to answer is, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, a service animal can only be a dog. Is that true or false? And I see Keith has a poll up on the screen. And so, okay. The poll says most say false. 86% say false and 14% say true. All right. So what is the true answer? Let's go to the next slide here. What is a service animal? So it must be a dog. And in some circumstances, it may be a miniature horse. And then, Marion, do you want to talk a little bit about when those circumstances might be a miniature horse?
Well, so most people use dogs, of course, and one of the reasons the definition now says any dog is because in the past it was more broad and it said any animal. And since a lot of people were successfully using miniature horses, when this definition changed, actually, I was the president of the National Association of Guide Dog Users, and I opposed the change without including miniature horses and urged the department to include that, as did many other people. It wasn't only me, but that is my position at the time, is that a lot of people were using miniature horses successfully. So there are circumstances under which miniature horses can be excluded because they have to take into consideration the size and the weight of the miniature horse in the particular place where that horse is going to be, because horses can weigh significantly more than a dog.
Mhm.
So.
But the horse has to be house trained, is that correct?
Yeah, so the same thing that applies to a dog applies to the horse. The horse must be individually trained to do work or tasks that benefit the person with a disability. The horse must be housebroken and must be kept under control on a harness, leash, or tether, unless the harness, leash, or tether interferes with the work that the horse is trained to perform, or the person is unable because of their disability to use a harness, leash, or tether.
Perfect, perfect. And I know you touched upon that it has to still be individually trained. Service animal, whether it's the dog or the miniature horse, must be individually trained to do work or perform specific tasks related to the person's disability. And there are no restrictions on the breed of dog or the type of disability. And the service animal must be under control of the handler at all times, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on about that. And then dogs that solely provide sense of security, emotional support, or companionship are not a service animal. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So again, it's the definition of a service animal is a dog individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, which means that the work or tasks that the dog is trained to perform, and when I say dog, this also applies to the horses as well. But for our purposes, we'll refer strictly to dogs throughout the rest of this webinar. So the work or the task that the dog is trained to perform must be directly related to the individual's disability. So just because a dog calms you because you pet the dog, that's not something the dog is doing. It's the innate capacity of the dog. So one way to think about it is this, that the dog is trained to react to some external trigger, whether it be a command from the handler, such as left, right, forward, as a person who uses a guide dog, or a trigger such as uh, sensing that a person is going to have a seizure. And then from that point, then the dog would then take specific action to mitigate that seizure. So it might clear a path around the person to keep it safe so that if the person's, while the person's having a seizure, uh, the person doesn't get injured. It may have an alert that it will activate, which will call for help, such as a 911, or do some other task that is triggered by a disability related need. So just because the dog is trained to sit and stay that's not a disability related task.
Right.
It has to be trained to react to a specific trigger that mitigates the disability.
Good. Thanks for the explanation.
Mhm.
And we know that service animals are not required to wear a vest or any specific identifying gear, nor can they be forced to be registered or have certification documents or some sort of training documents. Um, can you touch upon whether or not if there's a county ordinance requiring a dog to be registered, does a service animal have to be registered with the county?
Okay, well, one of the things the ADA says is that if a municipality requires all dogs to be registered, then service animals must be registered as well. Many municipalities provide some sort of a concession on the fee. So, but the dog still must be
Registered.
registered if all dogs are to be registered.
Mhm.
Now, registration refers to the registration that we would get. For instance, my dog wears a rabies tag, it's registered, has its tag that shows that it's been vaccinated. There's a difference between that sort of quote registration, which all dogs undergo, and a registration that might be specific to a service animal. So
Right.
if you live, for instance, in North Carolina, North Carolina has a service animal registry. You're not required to have to put your dog on the service animal registry, and your rights and your responsibilities are no less or greater if you do not register. So the reason for that is because the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically says that such registrations may not be required. They can be voluntary, but they can't be required. Unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges we have, especially in North Carolina, is that many times law enforcement will not enforce their state laws if they're not registered because they're misinformed about the purpose
Mhm.
and the scope of that registration.
And in Florida, we don't have anything like that where we can register service animals. Is that correct?
That's correct. Florida
Okay.
does not have that. To the best of my knowledge, North Carolina is the only one that has a registry. Now, that doesn't mean I know every single state law,
Right.
but and I do know that Michigan also offers a registration and a patch to put on your dog. But again, it's all voluntary.
Voluntary. Great.
There are states that do require things like one state in the Northeast requires that all service dogs wear a blue leash and collar because the ADA says that no specific gear can be required. That law would be considered unenforceable. I also want to say I'm not an attorney, so the
Mhm.
information that I'm giving is information as I understand it and is simply meant as guidance because I can't give you any sort of legal advice.
Understood. Understood. And I'm not an attorney either. So yes. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide, which is what can you ask and not ask? So when it's not obvious what a service animal provides or does, limited questions are allowed. So under the ADA, there are basically two allowable questions. One is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And the second is, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Some of the questions that are not allowed or things that are not allowed to be asked of the individual is proof of training or certification, which we just talked about, the nature of the disability, and then they cannot be asked to demonstrate the dog's task. And then again, no proof of vaccinations is required. Is there anything you want to add to that, Marion?
Yes. So this is something that's known as credible assurance, meaning the person with the service animal is giving some assurance to the business or entity asking the question, and that assurance must be credible or believable. So a lot of people say, well, anybody can answer the questions, right? And that's true. Any individual, any person can answer the question correctly if they want to pass their pet off as a service dog. But one of the things that's nearly impossible uh, to I'd say lie about is the behavior of the dog. So credible assurance and the answers to these questions also include: is it believable that the dog that you're looking at in front of you is a service dog? Is it sitting quietly next to the person? Is it paying attention to the person? Or is it going out to the end of its leash, greeting other people, barking, not under control? No matter how much the person may claim that the dog is a service dog, if the dog is not behaving in a way that is believable that it's a service dog, then you could have grounds to deny access to that person because they're not answering the questions credibly. One of the things that we mentioned earlier, and if we touch upon it later, well, let me know, but the dog must be under control.
Yes.
Are we going to discuss that a little later, or should I touch upon it now?
We mentioned it in the previous slide that the what is a service animal, and that has to be under control of this of the handler. So if you want to just expand on that, you sure.
Yes. So what we're referring to is what is known as direct control. Direct control means you have contact with the dog and it's restrained. So, in other words, the dog is kept on a leash, tether, or harness, as we've already stated, unless that leash, harness, or tether interferes with the work. But again, the dog must be kept under control. It shouldn't bark unless barking is its way of alerting. So some dogs are trained to bark, not incessantly, not disruptively, but in a way to perhaps get the person's attention, ground the person who may be having a psychotic episode. Sometimes the dog will bark to alert them to that and to help to ground them. So keeping the dog close to the individual and not letting it greet other people. And again, acting as one would expect a service animal to react to act, a well-trained dog and service animal.
Right. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide is handler responsibilities, and that's you just talked about that. The handler responsibilities of service animals under control of the handler. Doesn't bark or growl unprovoked, doesn't approach others, must be housebroken, it must be harnessed and leashed and tethered. Um, and then we talked about the exception if it prevents the device interfering with the service animal's safe, effective performance of the tasks. One thing that we didn't discuss, though, is um, service animals should not be placed in grocery carts or seated on vehicle seats or table seats or be fed from a restaurant table. Um, so those are certain things that I have seen myself dogs in a grocery cart, even though I know it's not permitted. But do you want to say a little bit about your experience and your thoughts on this?
Yes. So, for the most part, the rule of thumb that we hold within the service animal handling community is called four on the floor. In other words, the dog should be on the floor. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are some dogs who are able to, for instance, detect high or low blood sugar. And they do that by sniffing the person's breath. And so someone who has a service dog that does that may hold their dog in a harness on their chest so that the dog is close to their mouth and be able to smell their breath. But otherwise, the dog must be kept on the floor. There's a concept also called direct threat, which means that the presence of the dog in a particular situation causes a risk to the health or safety of others. And putting a dog in a shopping cart is considered a direct threat. So that is the reason why in the frequently asked questions about service animals, the DOJ specifically says service animals should not be allowed in shopping carts.
Right. It makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. So
Next,
also, I want to touch upon some other things. You mentioned some restaurant areas. And as you said, the dog should not sit on the seat. Again, that's a health code violation, and they
Right.
specifically have in the laws in the health code that prevent service animals from being on seats or being fed from the table. The other responsibility too for a service animal handler, say in a restaurant or in a place, maybe a crowded place, is to keep the dog close and out of the traffic area. So it is sometimes people will put their service dogs next to the table where they're eating, which is just fine, just as long as there's room for someone to get around the dog and the dog is not in like a hidden area where someone could come around a corner, say, and the dog would be sitting right there. So,
Right.
we need to keep our dogs close, under control, and make sure that they're in a safe position for the rest of the public.
Good point. Good point. All right. Our second poll question is ready here. The question is, if a service animal is out of control, can a business owner require the individual to leave the premises? Yes or no? And Keith has the poll up. All right, we have 92% say yes, the business owner can require the individual to leave the premises, and 8% said no. So, I know this is fun. The next slide says business owners, your role, your right. So, the business owner must allow the individual to bring their service animal into the business. They may ask the two allowable questions if it's not apparent what the service dog is doing and provided for. If the service animal is disruptive, the business owner may ask for the service animal to be removed, but not the individual. Business owner is not responsible for providing care or food for the service dog. And of course, allergies and fear of dogs are not a valid reason or valid reasons for denying entrance of a service animal with their individual. So, Marion, I know you want to talk about this about a business owner. So take it away.
Yes. Okay, good. So the as Barb said, what the implementing regulations of the Americans with Disabilities Act says is that if a business excludes a service animal based upon a valid reason, they must still give the individual the right to receive goods and services without the service dog being present. So if the dog is disruptive, then the dog can be removed, but the individual must still be allowed to get the goods and services of that particular entity.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
So it's a trick question. I realize that.
Yeah, I like the way you worded that. So,
All right.
and
Next slide.
one of the things
Okay.
while I'm here, one of the things I want to say is this: the right to be accompanied by a service animal is an individual's civil right. I hear many times people who use service dogs say, my dog has a right to be here. I have a right to be here, and I have a right to be accompanied by my dog. My dog does not have the right to be here. I do.
Right. Good point. Good point. All right. The next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the laws. So what laws are protection rights? So we will discuss and touch upon the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, the Air Carrier Access Act, and Florida Statute 413.08. So the first one we'll talk about is the ADA. So ADA is broken up into 5 titles, and the employment uh, is Title One, and it's enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it's to it applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees. And we'll talk a little bit later about specifically service animals in an employment setting. Title II is public services, which is state and local government, and that is enforced by the Department of Justice. the Title III, which is places of public accommodation. And we talk a lot about public accommodation because that's what we've touched upon with business owners and restaurants and stores and things like that. So Title III is a very big component to equal access, and that is also enforced by DOJ. And then Title IV is telecommunications, enforced by the Federal Communications Commission. Not a lot involving service animals with Title IV, but Title V, and I want Marion to talk a little bit about Title V miscellaneous.
Okay. We can touch upon that, and we're going to discuss the other ones
Yeah,
as well.
we're good.
Okay,
Yeah, we're
good.
good.
Okay, so the miscellaneous items that are in Title V, there are two specific ones that I want to discuss. One of them is the right to refuse an accommodation. What that means is if you go to a place with your service dog and someone says, "Oh, you can't bring your dog in here, but we will provide you whatever assistance you need," and you say, "No, I don't want to accept that aid or that service or that accommodation you're offering. I have a service dog because my service dog provides the services that I need, and I have the right to refuse an accommodation." So if someone tries to force you into an accommodation, you're not required to accept it. The other part of the miscellaneous provisions are prohibitions of harassment and retaliation. So if you file a complaint against a business and they retaliate against you, that's another offense under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's considered discrimination by retaliating and harassing the individual. So those are the two primary parts of Title V that I
Great.
wanted to bring up.
Great, thank you. We're going to go back and talk about Title I, 2, and 3 a little bit more here. So, Title I, an employee with a service animal must request reasonable accommodation from the employer prior to bringing the service animal to work. So, how does that work, Marion, with that? And I know that from my experience working with employment individuals in the employment arena, the the interactive process between the employer and the individual is really important. But if there is a process, unlike a Title III entity where you have presumption approval of bringing your service animal with you into a public place, Title I is a little bit different.
Yes. So the big difference is this, and I tell people this a lot when I hear them using these terms. Title I provides, as Barb said, requires an employer to make a reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is a negotiation. You begin by making a request. So you've got a job, you have a service dog, and you request from the employer the permission from them, the right to bring your service dog to work with you. They must allow the accommodation unless they can prove certain things. One of them is that the presence of the animal poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others that can't be eliminated. Another is if and these are just generally why an employer could refuse a reasonable accommodation, not necessarily for a service dog, but for instance, an employer could refuse a reasonable accommodation because it would have a financial impact that cannot be absorbed by the company. That's not something that's going to happen with a service dog because there's no expense on the part of the employer or nothing that they need to do in order to allow that service animal. So those are the two reasons why an employer could deny the reasonable accommodation.
Great, great. Title II and Title III are similar in that most facilities, either a government building or a place of public accommodation, must allow a service animal into their facility with the individual or the handler. Um, and so that we've talked a lot about Title III. Do you want to talk a little bit about Title II and how that would look for someone? Um, I know Title II also, it's not only their facilities, access into the facilities, it's their programs and services that have to be accessible. So,
Correct.
um,
So again, Title II covers what we call public entities. A public entity is a governmental entity, and Title III covers private entities that provide public accommodation. And the reason I stress that so much is because there is a misconception, not only among the general public, but I've even heard it from law enforcement, that a business has the right to refuse service to anyone they wish for any reason they wish. And that is just simply untrue. Um, since 1964, that has been untrue when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, because a private company cannot discriminate against a person and deny them goods and services based upon race, religion, ethnicity, and now, according to the ADA, disability. So the belief that a private company has the right to refuse anyone they wish for any reason is not true. People with disabilities, and as well as those other characteristics, are what we consider a protected class, and we are protected from discrimination because of that characteristic of disability. Now,
right.
what I want to say is that in Title II and III, unlike Title I, which requires a reasonable accommodation and an interactive process, Titles II and III use the terms modification of policies, practices, and procedures. And what that means is they are required to allow the service animal and to modify their policies, practices, and procedures so that an individual with a disability can have the same access as others who are what they call similarly situated, or the term as relevant. And what that means is this: if you go into a retail store, you have the right to access every part of that retail store, the grocery, all of the other areas within that retail store. But as a patron and guest, you don't have the right to go into the stock room, for instance. And so, because you don't have the right to go into the stock room, you don't have the right to take your service animal into that. That's what they are referring to as the as relevant. So if let's say a delivery person has a service dog, now delivery people are allowed in the stock room, and they would then be able to take their service animal into the stock room because they're provided the same access as others as relevant. And the relevancy is that they are a person who would normally be allowed into the stock room. Does that
We,
make?
yeah, you kind of touched upon exceptions, which is also, I know that there's religious organizations and private clubs that have exceptions, and also sterile environments such as surgery rooms or food prep areas in like at a restaurant. So that kind of goes along with those are not typically places where everybody is allowed to go. You have to have reason to be in those places.
Yes, well, and also um, because of the separation of church and state, that's the reason why churches are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act, as are private clubs. Now, a private club is a club that has specific membership guidelines.
Right.
So I try to avoid using names. Okay, so let's
Hmm.
see, a warehouse club. We know there's a
Hmm.
few of those around. They are not a private club because anyone who can pay the
The
fee
membership
to
fee,
become a
right?
member is therefore a member. So they don't have specific membership requirements
Right.
as a private club would. So, for instance, we have a private club here in Tampa called the Tampa Club, and it's only open to specific people, and you have to make application. And there are membership requirements in order to be a member of the club. They could, if they wanted to, deny access to people with disabilities accompanied by service animals if they wish, because they're exempt from the ADA.
ADA. All right. Just time-wise, we've got about maybe 14 minutes or so left, or maybe less. And we're just about halfway through the slide, so we need to go a little bit faster, I think. Um,
Okay.
so the next slide is Florida Statute 413.08. And that's a Florida specific law regarding service dogs and service animals. And it establishes the rights for equal access for those who use the use of service animals to places of public accommodation, employment, and housing. It outlines penalties for violations, and statute provides for penalties against those who discriminate or interfere with a service animal. And the interference examples could be examples of imposed penalties include obstructing, intimidating, jeopardizing the safety of, or intentionally injuring or killing a service animal. Um, I think the law is pretty similar to ADA, but if you could talk a little bit briefly about the penalties and the violations and how 413.08 differs from the ADA.
Okay, very good. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal civil law, whereas the Florida statute, and of course, well, not of course, but also 36 other states have very similar statutes, and they provide for criminal misdemeanor penalties. So, unlike a civil clause, which does not could not end up in any sort of incarceration or arrest or anything of that nature, the 37 states, including Florida, who have these laws, provide for criminal remedies as a result of either denying or interfering with access. And there's advantages and disadvantages of both, but the biggest advantage to having a criminal statute is that you can then seek law enforcement intervention. And a law enforcement officer does have the right to arrest someone who is violating your civil rights. However, very few law enforcement officers know that. There have been a few cases in the state of Florida. I've been involved in 2 or 3 of them, and I've advocated for others who have also filed criminal charges. But there are advantages and disadvantages, but the biggest advantage is then you can seek law enforcement intervention. Law enforcement is very unaware of these laws, so it's really good for you to know what your statute in your state is, at least the number 413.08, and that way they can look it up in their little electronic handbook and read the law themselves.
Great. Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. Poll question number 3. I think this is our last one. Do shelters allow service animals into them? Yes or no? Do shelters allow service animals? Yes or no? And shelters could be homeless shelters, emergency, weather-related emergency shelters, cold night shelters, domestic violence shelters. So broad definition of shelters there. 91% said yes, service animals are allowed, and 9% said no, they are not allowed. So I know you're going to want to talk about this. So
yes.
On this slide, it says, can my service animal go there? Yes, you can go here, and no, you cannot go here. Let's start with the no, you cannot go here. The food prep areas in the restaurant kitchens, we talked about sterile environments like operating rooms, isolation rooms, ICU with equipment for life support. And that can be a case by case situation. Some pre-op settings restrict service animals, but where can you go? And so we've talked about, stores and theaters and certainly medical offices, on a plane, in a cab, stores, but shelters. Let's talk about shelters. And Marion, what do you say about the shelters?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act has a list of 12 different categories of businesses that are considered what they call covered entities, and included in them are shelters, homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, as you said, cold weather shelters. One of the things that advocates for service animal partners had noticed is that between the time of right about now until about the middle of February, we have an increase in calls to our hotline from survivors of domestic violence. And so one of the things that we have done is published a in-depth manual to help domestic violence shelters navigate the service animal landscape. And we're working on that for other shelters as well as for public accommodations. So the bottom line is that any place an individual is invited, a person has the right to be accompanied by their service animal in all of those places as relevant. So in a domestic violence shelter or any other shelter, the goods and services of the shelter are available to a person with a disability accompanied by a service dog, as well as any other individual who comes seeking that sort of protection.
Right. Great. And I know that ASAP is doing some good work on that. So
Thank you.
next slide is just some fun pictures. So this is, oh, the places we will go. And we have a picture of Marion with his service dog, Sarge, feeding a giraffe at a local zoo. We have a picture of someone sitting at a cafe table with his service dog laying down next to him, next to the table. We have a young girl sitting at a library with her service dog's nose right in the book and looks like she's reading to him, or maybe the service dog is reading to her. And then lastly is we have a young woman who looks like she's in a dorm room with her service animal. And yes, service animals can be in dorm rooms and in the library and at the zoo and in the cafe, all the places they can go, and many, many more, obviously. Next slide, talk a little bit about Fair Housing Act. And we have just a few minutes left, Marion, so this will have
Okay,
to.
sure.
So
The
go ahead.
Fair Housing Act, we're having some challenges here because the Department of Housing and Urban Development recently withdrew its original guidance. And so now things with the FHA are a little different. So again, a property must allow an individual with a disability to be accompanied by their service dog. It is, again, back, we're talking about the reasonable accommodation. You do need to request a reasonable accommodation, and they are required to allow the service dog and to provide your reasonable accommodation unless they can prove that your dog poses a direct threat or that the presence of the dog poses what is known as an undue burden. In other words, it would cost too much to do this, which is just not the case. And so under the Fair Housing Act, they cannot charge pet deposits, and they are not allowed to charge any sort of monthly fees. Now, the interesting thing about the Fair Housing Act is that it not only includes service animals, but the Fair Housing Act includes emotional support animals. And under the Fair Housing Act, if your disability is not readily apparent, you may be required to demonstrate the fact that you have a disability, not what the disability is, but that you have one. And some of those things are like SSDI or SSI payments, or some other benefit that you receive as the result of your disability, or a letter from a healthcare provider or some social service organization which acknowledges the fact that you are a person with a disability.
And the assistance animal can be something other than a dog, correct?
Yes, assistance animals can virtually be any sort of animal. They can make some restrictions upon it. I believe one of the restrictions that the Fair Housing Act actually has are reptiles. But don't quote me on that, but that's one of the
Right,
exclusions that I thought I had seen somewhere, but I'm
right.
not sure of that. But again, emotional support animals And service animals are under the broad umbrella of what they call an assistance animal.
Right. Very good. Next
Oh, and they
slide.
can also require proof of vaccination. That's
That's another, okay,
that's
that's good
another
to know.
element that's not part of any of the other laws.
Perfect. Great. Thanks for that specific information. Air Carrier Access Act. So specific regulations exist for air travel. And of course, it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities for U.S. and foreign air carriers. They must provide assistance with getting on and off the plane. They must allow service animals. But now airlines are now requiring completion of a service animal air transportation form. You want to talk briefly about that?
Yeah, the Department of Transportation has recently instituted this because of all of the abuses that they were facing with airlines, not with airlines, but with people claiming that all sorts of animals were their service animals in order to avoid pet fees for transporting the animal and to avoid putting them in the cargo hold. So we now have to complete a Department of Transportation attestation form about our service dog. And one of the things that confuses people a lot, I will say most people who have service dogs have what they call owner trained service dogs. In other words, we train our own dog as opposed to a program dog, like going to the Seeing Eye, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, and so on the form, it asks who trained the dog, and you either put like the program or you can also put owner trained.
Okay, very good. All right,
And
next slide.
they also require proof of vaccination.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Not well,
Um,
at least an attestation that the dog has been vaccinated.
okay, very good. Other modes of transportation that also allow service animals, public and private transportation, such as city buses, paratransit, private taxis and cab services, Ubers and Lyfts are supposed to. We know there's been a lot of talk about that being a problem, but they are supposed to allow service animals in their vehicles. And then of course trains and Amtrak, and then in Florida we have Brightline service animals all allowed on all these transportations.
Yes.
And
The Department of Justice is currently suing Uber for $125 million for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act by not providing equal service to people who use service dogs and people who use wheelchairs.
we'll keep an eye on that.
Mhm.
Next slide. Okay, what to do if you are denied access? Of course, self-advocate. Go up the chain of command, ask for a supervisor or a manager. If there's a corporate office, contact a corporate office. Follow up in writing, contact ASAP or Disability Rights Florida. File complaints with the proper enforcement agency, where we talked about the Department of Justice, EEOC, depending what violation occurred. There's an agency, an enforcement agency attached to it. And of course, there's always the option of private lawsuits. Um,
Yes.
and then the next few slides are just where to turn for help. We have Disability Rights Florida, advocates for service animals and partners, and our phone numbers and websites are listed. Department of Justice, the EEOC, the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and Department of Transportation. And then questions, please contact us at this number. This is our last slide coming up, and it is feedback survey. So please use our QR code.
All right. Well, thank you, Marion and Barb. What a great presentation. Before we begin taking questions, I want to bring everyone's attention to the QR code on the screen. It will take you to a short survey asking for your opinion on the content presented today. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to give us your feedback so that we can continue to improve the programs we offer. There is a link to the survey in the chat if you prefer not to use a QR code. You can scan the QR code or click the link now and wait until after the question answer session to complete it if you would like. So we have about 9 minutes left for questions. As a reminder, if you have a question, please post it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and try to limit personal information about yourself. So I'm going to go right to the first question. We actually have quite a few. And here we go. All right. Many condos often require the dog to be both registered and have medical documentation before the unit owner is allowed to have the dog. Is this allowable, or is that asking for too much information?
Well, they're not allowed to ask for, quote, medical information about the dog, but they are allowed to ask for proof that the dog has been vaccinated.
Okay, all right, very good. Are there exceptions with disabled veterans? For instance, if a veteran with a service-related disability like PTSD has a dog to ease the PTSD, are they not protected as a service animal?
It depends. Again, the service animal, by definition, is trained to do work or perform tasks. If the presence of the dog is all that is alleviating the symptoms, then it's not a service dog. For post-traumatic stress, one of the things that a service dog can do is to apply deep pressure therapy, ground the person by, like, say, pushing up against them. One of the things we talked about was the dog off leash. People with post-traumatic stress may not want to enter into a room they're not familiar with, so they may let the dog go into the room first, check the room for safety, and then come back and notify the handler that the room is safe to enter. So again, that's another disability related service. So the dog has to do something as the result of the trigger. It's not just the dog is here and it keeps me calm.
Mm-hmm.
That's an emotional support animal, and the ADA does not recognize emotional support animals.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Barb, did you need to add something to that?
Nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay.
Just confirming what he said.
Okay. I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer this one, but Barb, you may know the answer to it, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. What is the statute of limitations to file a complaint for employment discrimination, also discrimination on public transit?
The rule of thumb is usually 180 days, but I don't know if they're both 180 days.
Yeah, I think I would suggest to this person that you call our office and
Yeah.
they'll be able to answer that question. Since we mentioned earlier that Marion and Barb are not attorneys, that's I didn't expect them to have that information. So
But it is important that you know when
yes,
your time limit is up. So yeah, it's a good question to
yeah,
ask
it's
and
a
be
very
aware
good
of.
question.
And
Yeah.
I have read in the DOJ information that 180 days is the time frame, and that can be confirmed by, I think it's in the frequently asked questions.
Okay, great. All right. One more question. Do people use service animals for psychiatric disabilities? Can you talk about the difference between psychiatric service animal and emotional support service animal?
Yes. So again, yes, people who have psychiatric disabilities do use service dogs. Again, post-traumatic stress is a psychiatric disability. And so dogs can be trained to perform many functions. People who have schizophrenia, for instance, their dog can help to ground them, to recognize a psychotic break and take action. But again, the dog must be trained to do something that mitigates a disability. So it's
Right.
required to take some action as a result of some disability related trigger.
Right.
There
It
is a
wouldn't be
whole, there is an organization called Psychiatric Service Dogs, and in fact, their president is a member of our board of directors.
It wouldn't be enough just to have a psychiatric disability and in a dog uh, that comforts you or keeps you in a good state of mind or a good position. It really has to do something. It's all about the action, the training and the action.
Hmm. Right. Emotional support animals are not trained
Yeah.
to do work. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's a good clarification. And I want to remind everybody, we have about 4 minutes, so if you still have questions and want to type them in, please go ahead.
There are
So
2 questions in the chat if you want to
did I
read
miss that?
those.
I'm sorry. Okay, thanks, Keith. Um, okay. What are the rules for service dogs in training?
Okay, good question. So the definition says a service dog is trained to do work. It's not in training to do work, but it is trained to do work. Service dogs in training, however, are protected by most state laws. A state can make a law that expands the rights of an individual. They can't make a law that restricts it. So they couldn't say, for instance, you can't take your dog here or there, but they can say that service dogs in training are allowed because you see, the ADA says the dog must be trained. So the implication is it is already trained. But I don't know of any state that does not allow service dogs in training
Right.
uh, to have the same access.
But I think it's important for the individual to realize that, at least in Florida, it would be the Florida statute 413.08 that protects them with their dog in training versus the ADA, which is not active at that point.
Right. And keep in mind too, ADA protects individuals with disabilities
Right.
and sometimes the person training it is not a person with a disability.
Right.
So a person without a disability does not have access with a service dog. So like my sister couldn't take my service dog into a public place. She's not disabled.
Right. That's a good point.
Points, good point. Okay. Um, what do you do when you go to an allergist and there is a sign that states that no dogs are allowed? It doesn't specifically say no service dogs. What are your rights in that situation?
And allergies and fear of animals are generally not reasons to exclude a person with a disability. Now, it says generally. There are cases, and the reason for that is because uh, allergies to dog dander do not generally rise to the level of a disability. However, they can. It's very, very, very rare, 0.005%, which is one in, I forget, so many 100,000. I mean, it's a very rare occurrence. If that does occur, then both people need to be accommodated. In other words, if I'm in a place where a person has such an allergy, then it's up to the public accommodation to um,
To
help
accommodate both of you. Yeah.
yes, I'm trying to avoid using the word accommodate, but yeah, to
Yeah.
accommodate
Right.
both of you. And that could mean the person, you're separated from each other.
Right.
But
It would.
it's up to them. So, we have a lot of problems in healthcare facilities,
Mhm.
uh, exam rooms and dentist's office. You know, there's there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, which is another project of Advocates for Service Animal Partners is to train healthcare providers on these statutes as well.
Great.
Okay, good, very good. Okay, we have reached our time here with the webinar. Marion and Barb, thank you so much for the valuable information you've provided. Thank you to our ASL interpreters and our captioning partner. Just to let everyone know, the webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be available on our website within a week. Thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.